Talking about some work that's a joint work with me and Stephen Young. And if you were at the machine learning and HPC workshop yesterday, this will look pretty familiar. So it's sort of a combination of the two of our talks. But with that being said, we'll just go right into it. So at the national labs, we're typically interested in problems that are sort of different than what people in industry are typically interested in. And so a lot of the things that we do is we spend a lot of time trying to design neural nets for those problems. So these come from scientific data sets and the like. And so basically, I mean, you've all seen ImageNet, I assume, and things like that. So on the commercial side of things, you have lots of data, and you typically have lots of data that is labeled very cheaply. You know, maybe people are uploading images to Facebook and tagging their friends for you. Or they're the kind of images that anybody on the street could label. But at the National Lab, we're looking at things that typically need someone who's very specialized in order to be able to label them. And we may be trying to label things like polar bears in Africa. There might only be one or two examples in the world out there. So we're really data limited. And the data sets that we're looking at are typically not, I mean, the images don't look like the same kinds of things that you see in typical commercial applications. So that leads to a challenge of how do you design a neural net for those types of applications, right? So the idea is that for any application that you have, or at least for image recognition type things or a lot of these type things, there's going to be a neural net topology that's going to be optimal for your data set. And there's this sort of notion that there's a state-of-the-art network out there, right? And when people say state-of-the-art, now they're usually talking things like ResNet 50 or something like this. But that's really it's state-of-the-art on ImageNet, right? So there's this no free lunch theorem that tells you that there's not going to be a single neural net that's optimal for every task, right? Every learning task. So we're really all about designing these nets, and how do we go about doing that? And the typical approach is sort of trial and error based. Maybe people have developed intuition over a lot of trial and error. But again, these are sort of typically ImageNet-like things that they've developed intuition on, which may or may not translate very well to a scientific realm. So if you're out there and you're trying to deploy a neural net, you're going to grab something out of the box. Maybe you grab an AlexNet or GoogleNet, something out of the box. You've picked your favorite framework, Caffe, TensorFlow, whatever. You have all these knobs that you can sort of turn, and people will play with those, start adjusting things, and sort of watch, is this doing good? If not, you just sort of keep adjusting. Maybe you understand what the parameter's doing, maybe not. I think people tend to not really understand as much as they think they do what's going on here, right? But you play with the knobs. That didn't work, so well, add a few layers. That's bound to work, right? But eventually, you sort of just get frustrated, and this is nothing's working, and you're just sort of stuck, right? So that's the sort of situation that we find ourselves in a lot, or that I think a lot of people find themselves in. And so what I want to talk about today is basically, if something just out of the box isn't working for you, what can you realistically do? So a common thing will be something like a hyperparameter sweep, right? So you take a network out of the box, you do hyperparameter sweeps to try to optimize that, and maybe you find something good, maybe not. The big problem here is something you can do pretty effectively in the sense that you don't have to train a lot of neural nets to do it, but you have this big assumption that your hyperparameters are independent, and that's generally a bad assumption to make. You might try something more like a grid search, but that's all kinds of bad because you have, it's infeasible usually, because the number of networks that you're going to have to train is going to be exponential in the number of parameters that you're tuning. So it's generally infeasible, and you also end up wasting a lot of time sort of oversampling parameters that are not very impactful on your performance. So it turns out that just randomly searching is usually a lot better than grid searching. But again, the problem is that as you're training networks, you're learning whether or not that network was good or bad. And if you just continue to randomly search, you're sort of throwing away that extra bit of information that you have. So the first technique that we're going to talk about, and I should mention, so I'm assuming everyone's sort of familiar with Oak Ridge. We have this really nice machine, Titan, with 18,000 GPUs on it, right? So it's in the back of our mind, we're thinking, if we have 18,000 GPUs, we should be able to do some really cool stuff, right? That's sort of the idea. So we've developed two frameworks, and I'll talk about both of these briefly. The way the first one works is you start with a random sampling, and you identify some of these hyperparameters which are bad, and some of them which are good, right? So this is just purely random, no human intuition required. And then you build a model, and in this case a support vector machine, where you try to decide just sort of, in between these lines, those networks are pretty good. So we think that's sort of the good area to continue searching. And then we continue our random searching, but we only look in the area that the support vector machine thinks will be good. And it turns out this is very effective. And just to show you how good it is, we have one application here. So this is overhead imagery. We're detecting clouds. Application doesn't matter so much, but if you just randomly search, what you see is here we trained 11,000 networks, and about 88% of those networks are just terrible. They're never better than guessing, right? So you can think of that as a lot of wasted computation. But if we train our support vector machine to just recognize when are we even just better than guessing, so our threshold for being a good network is better than guessing, right? So low bar, and then we continue the training. What we see instead is something like this. So now we've gone from 88% of the networks being bad to about 80% of the networks being very good. And once we have this large pile, so in this case we've trained 4,000 networks. Now we have a large pile, several thousand networks which are all very good. That gives us a lot of extra opportunity where we can do things like multi-objective optimization. If we want to look at memory footprint, inferencing time, other statistical measures aside from accuracy. If we want to ensemble these networks, using something like AdaBoost or anything like that, right, we have a huge pile of good networks that we can draw from and build even better networks. So the first framework is RAVENNA, and that's actually implemented in Apache Spark right now. It uses Caffe as the backend for training neural nets, and we have that running on Titan. We've done it up to 18,000 nodes of Titan, so it's by far the largest Spark cluster in the world. I think the second largest is Tencent in China, I believe. It's about 8,000 nodes. And our typical jobs, we run 1 to 4,000 nodes. And it turns out that if you have a single framework that you're tuning, tens of thousands of networks that you train is pretty sufficient to get good networks. Okay. As an example, when I was optimizing the cloud detection over here, this whole process took less than an hour. And we were able to develop to fine-tune a network that was actually as a variation of Linnet. So if you're familiar, Linnet's 20 years old, 6 layers deep. It's a fairly small network. We're able to get better performance on this particular task than out-of-the-box networks, GoogleNet, AlexNet, VGGNet on cloud detection. So we not only improve accuracy, but we cut the prediction time dramatically in half, reduce memory footprint, a lot of other things. So moral of the story is, even with a small network, you can potentially do very well on your data set. It just sort of depends on what you need. Okay, and we've applied this to a bunch of different data sets. You might be wondering if this sort of split is something that you would see commonly. And there's a mathematical reason for why you see this sort of gap between guessing and better than guessing. But in practice, it tends to work. We've applied it to a number of data sets. Okay. One of the limitations, though, of this technique, RAVENNA, is that you really have to have a fixed set of layers. So you have to pick something out of the box, and then you just want to tune the hyperparameters in that network. And the reason for that is because if you change, what a layer is or how many layers you have, you've suddenly changed the number of hyperparameters that you have to vary, and then you're sort of optimizing in a completely different space, right? And the vectors that you're comparing, they're not really comparable anymore. So this technique requires you to have a sequence of layers that are not changing, right? But let's say you want to be more general and just let those layers change. Like, what can you do? So that's where we have the second approach called MENNDL. And MENNDL's a completely evolutionary algorithm, which is also running at scale on Titan. And this allows you to vary the layer types, the number of layers. Every parameter inside the network can be evolved genetically. So if you're not familiar with how genetic algorithms work, I'm happy to go over the details with you after this. The general idea is that you encode your neural net as a sequence of genes, and then you do mutations. So you take good networks that's sort of like good genes, and you let them reproduce with other good genes, and you create a new gene pool, right? So this is the high-level idea. There are a few design sort of limitations that we put on this, and that was just sort of for practical reasons. So for example, we require that our first layers be what we call feature layers. So these are things like convolutions, pooling, activation layers, that sort of thing drop out. Like these can be in the front stack of layers, and then on the back stack we have classification layers, which we think of typically as things like inner product layers. Again, drop out, and activation layers we can include. And the way this works on Titan and why it works so well on a big parallel machine is that the genetic algorithm that's deciding which networks should be trained is very lightweight. Right? That can run on a single node, creates a large pool of genes to evaluate, and then you have all these workers, so 18,000 plus GPUs, that each one can individually train neural nets, and it just reports back when it's done training, how good was that neural net, and then the master process with the genetic algorithm can decide if it wants to let that gene propagate into the gene pool in the future. So this is the overview of how that works. The communication, again, is very minimal. It takes some time to train a neural net, right? Everyone knows that. And if you're just passing a sort of a sequence of genes out to your nodes once every 15, 45 minutes or so, and then you're just pegging out the GPU for 45 minutes, it's a lot of compute and not a lot of communication. So it's really nice for that type of application. So I'll just show you briefly a few results that we have. So we apply this to a number of different networks. The first one, this is just a CFAR10, so a very simple network, starting from completely random, and in this case, only on 4 nodes, so a small test case. It ran for, I believe this ran for a couple of weeks on 4 nodes. Okay, so it's a little bit longer, but you see it evolved from basically knowing nothing up to 65% accuracy, which for CFAR is not that great, but again, it's 4 nodes, right? If we seed the genetic algorithm with something that's already decent, so okay, there we go. Yeah, sorry. We seed it with a network which is already good, so it's getting 75% accuracy from the get-go. Again, over a few days using 4 nodes, it evolves to something that's better, up to 82%. So CFAR, these are sort of toy examples that everyone plays with. You have to just test on that to make sure that your network is actually working. Right, so here's an example of a high-energy physics application that we've applied it to. And so we won't get too much into the physics. The idea is you have neutrinos that are flying through. They collide with things periodically in these detectors. And I basically just sort of imagine like fireworks going off when it actually hits something, right? So you can sort of see the pictures. And the question that they're trying to answer is, where did the fireworks start, right? So you can sort of, in the middle picture here, you can sort of see, like, it looks like it crashed right there and sort of exploded, right? So the idea is, can you detect where those interactions happened? And so the scientists up at, I believe this is Fermilab. This is work that Stephen Young did, so I'm possibly slightly fuzzy on the details, but this is work at Fermilab. There's scientists up there. They had a group of people that spent about 9 months testing networks out of the box, trying to design their own network. Took them 9 months to find something suitably accurate. We run this on MENNDL on all of Titan overnight and have a result that's better than any human engineered network for this particular data set. Again, I'm not claiming that the network that was evolved will beat a ResNet 50 on ImageNet or something like that, right? But for this data set, for this problem, it's better than any human engineered network. And it also discovered that it evolves some features that periodically that are unusual. So if you've built some of these networks before, you've probably seen dropout layers, and they typically will stick these towards the end of a network, in the inner product layers at the end, right? But what MENNDL evolved actually was sticking these dropout layers at the very beginning of the network. And so what we decided was probably going on, again, it's sort of hard to know exactly what's going on in the black box, but these are cases where we were training with very little labeled training data. So we sort of view this as a way of data augmentation by manipulating your input data. And we guessed, again, this is a design choice, but we didn't allow dropout layers to be right on top of the input data. It was just a design choice. So after the first layer is the earliest possible place that MENNDL could put a dropout layer. Again, that's just for sort of implementation details, but it put it there, and we're sort of curious if had it stuck it right over the input data, would that have been even better? We've also partnered with St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, And this is an example of an image here. They're looking for mitochondria in cell samples from the brain. And again, they had people there working on designing a neural net for the task. They spent a fair amount of time doing that. Again, we get the data, no domain knowledge, just some labeled data. Feed it into MENNDL on Titan. Again, overnight, I think it's 24 hours in this case. It trained 900,000 neural nets in those 24 hours and evaluated them and found one that was better than any of the human engineered networks, at this task. Right, so reducing the error by 30% over the best human engineered network. So the idea, the overall idea of both of these techniques is, we use neural nets because the idea is we don't want humans to sort of have to handcraft features, right? That's the whole benefit of deep learning is you don't have a human hand engineering features. So why should the human hand engineer what the network looks like, right? It's sort of counterintuitive. And so the demonstration here is that basically you can let the computer learn how to build the networks, and you can do it very effectively when you have a lot of compute resources. And sometimes you don't need, so like the examples we had at the beginning, with RAVENNA, for example, training 500 to 1,000 networks is usually good enough to fine-tune those pretty well. And even with just 4 nodes for a couple of weeks, you can do reasonably well with MENNDL, right? So it's that long tail that you're improving over when you have a big machine like Titan. And just a couple quick stats for MENNDL. So like I said, we've used all of Titan, so it's over 18,000 nodes. This is sort of a conservative estimate, but we typically see about 500,000 networks trained in 24 hours. Depending on the data set, we can train closer to 1 million networks in 24 hours. And we've applied that to about a dozen different data sets now. I've just sort of highlighted a couple of the ones with really pretty pictures. And we have a large team of people who are collaborating. These are scientists who provide data. We have people who are helping us actually engineer the code, so just acknowledge those here. And that's all I have, so we have plenty of time for some questions. And also mention, maybe Alexandra will mention this, but I'll be with the Meet the Experts after this for a while. If you have like really in the weeds questions, and maybe not everyone's interested in that, but I'm happy to answer any of those questions as well.